We're pretty much 3 years into the Cannan administration, but has much changed? There certainly seem to be a few glimmers of progress, but is the change that was promised being felt yet by the people? The Chief Minister is very upbeat about the progress his government is making, and he joins me now in the studio. You've been to London this week.
So we had an invitation, which came somewhat out of the blue, to be represented at Westminster for the King's speech, and that invitation was extended to the other Crown dependencies as well. Given the significance of the occasion with the new Labour government and the amount of time since they'd last been in power, it was a good opportunity to go down to represent the island. And from a national level, I think it was pleasing to have that recognition and to be placed alongside the other ambassadors and high commissioners and representatives from international jurisdictions, and to be given that status. And of course that meant also the opportunity to meet some of the new incoming MPs and also other relevant dignitaries. So it was an impressive occasion, but I'm pleased that the island was recognised and that we were able to engage at that level with some members of the new British government. Clearly this was very much a parliamentary occasion in terms of the invitation had come from the Speaker. And by the way, Lindsay Hoyle has done a huge amount to foster good relations both with the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories. But this, as far as I know, is the first time the Chief Minister has been invited in that capacity. So I'm really pleased for the island that I was able to go.
One, stark difference, I suppose, between the King's speech and what your government has been able to deliver is King's speech refers to 39 bills. Many of these bills are in relation to freeing up systems that are very much things that you talk a lot about, trying to improve the planning system so that things happen more quickly, trying to speed up the economic growth, the pace at which the economy is recovering from COVID. Whether you agree or you disagree with the Labour Party's policies, there's no doubt about it. They have a clear idea about what they want to do and the legislative changes they're going to make to kickstart their economy and get things moving. That does sort of put into fairly stark contrast the situation in terms of the bills that your government's managed to get through in 3 years.
Well, I think it's probably a pretty unfair comparison, if I'm brutally honest, Phil. First of all, the sheer size and scale of the UK in terms of its population and the need. Clearly, there was a need from as evidenced in the election for change. The Labour government have come in. They promised 35 pieces of legislation. Of course, the detail and the impact of that legislation will, of course, need to be seen. And as you know, promises are made at the beginning and often not necessarily that easy to deliver, or if they are delivered, they have side effects and knock-on impacts that aren't always well received. So, look, listen, I think, for an impressive King's speech, anyone listening to that, I think, would have been impressed. And look, I'm broadly actually quite enthused by some of what has been said. But like-for-like comparisons, I certainly don't think pertinent. I think we need to focus on what we are doing over here and our needs as an island. But that's not to say there aren't clear linkages in terms of what the UK are doing. And I think from that King's speech, I'm certainly not in the camp of being negative, because I think actually anybody who sets out for clear economic growth across the United Kingdom is going to align it with the Isle of Man's position. And my general view, I'm not in that camp of things are bad in the UK, therefore they're going to be good in the Isle of Man. Actually, success in the United Kingdom generally means that the island will also be successful. So I think, when I sort of heard the King's speech and I tweeted out, I said, look, I'm really pleased to hear that strong emphasis on economic growth, because if we can work together mutually now, given this sort of post-Brexit environment, the free trade agreements, this international exposure, then we can sit and align ourselves alongside the United Kingdom. And of course, that's why I felt also that recognition and being invited down to listen to the King's speech was important. And then, look, if we're going to have a a good, mature relationship with the United Kingdom moving forward, and we're going to be very much treated on that partnership level, then we're off to a good start, and I hope it continues.
In relation to that, I mean, one thing that certainly I experienced as a minister in the years I was in Council of Ministers was the frustration and the difficulty that you can only influence so much, but without that wave of success across the United Kingdom, without that strong economy, it's actually really difficult to make anything move in the Isle of Man, isn't it?
Well, I certainly think if the UK economy is sort of underperforming or is in very slow growth mode, it doesn't make it easier for us over here. And we've seen that, the cost of living crisis, for example, the almost slight dip into recession, the 0% growth. Actually compare that, interestingly enough, with what we've just had through in terms of the assessment from Moody's. The Isle of Man saw 1.5% growth in 2023, and they're forecasting that to rise to 3% in 2025, and said that we were outperforming most of Europe. So actually, I mean, yes, we've had our difficulties, but when you benchmark that just on that growth figure in terms of economic performance, we've outstripped the vast majority of Europe, including the United Kingdom. So actually, we should be relatively pleased, just basing it on the fact that actually, an independent advisory assessment group, Moody's, have looked at us and said, actually, you are outperforming most of your competitors across Europe. And but having said that, we do feel, of course, the same squeeze, the same impacts, and we've been through huge amounts with cost of living and the problems that we've had and the post-COVID issues. But going back to the fundamentals that have been outlined by Keir Starmer, I've got to be positive. I want to be positive, and as I said, I hope that with that maturity of relationship, and I think it has been a relationship that's been maturing, and I've worked hard and others have worked hard in the last 3 years to get ourselves into that position. We're actually trying to put ourselves on an equal footing so that free trade agreements and other international negotiations when it comes to the economy, that the Isle of Man is thought of and included as part of that British family. And we can contribute from that respect, in that respect, Phil, and drawing that out and making it clear to our counterparts in Westminster how that contribution is being used efficiently, effectively to create jobs, support economic growth, support lending, is part of my role, and that's what I continue to do.
One of the constant fears that exist when a Labour government comes into power is that Labour Party generally is not that keen on what they describe as tax havens, and they would describe the Isle of Man as such. Are there any reasons that you've heard so far to be concerned?
Yeah, I think don't get complacent about it, and we know that there are detractors who will look to attack the island. But I think the sort of myths that they create can become by themselves almost sort of believable truths unless you work incredibly hard to make sure that people fully understand that the position of the island. So there are people that Labour Party individuals, high profile people like Margaret Hodge, no secret, for example, that she's very anti the Isle of Man, the Crown dependencies, the overseas territories, but actually really fails to recognise the progress that we have made as an island, the rules and regulations that we now have to abide by, and indeed our full commitment to international standards. And so actually making that clear is, again, a job that we need to continuously do and remind ourselves and remind people in Westminster that we are up there with the very best in terms of our standards and our assessments. And also, of course, we do have these new tax pillars coming in, this international tax of which we're committed to now. So we will very soon have 15% tax being applied to our very largest companies, and we're part of the international tax network, if you like, that have signed up to this. And so actually throwing aspersions at us that we're some sort of tax haven really doesn't stand up now to any serious analysis. But nevertheless, I need to stop misrepresentation of the island when it occurs, and so therefore continuing to meet with influential MPs in the Treasury, to meet with influential MPs in the Ministry for Justice, to carry on discussing with other MPs, whether they are on the backbenches or in the opposition, our status, our position, what we are doing to contribute to the British economy, the jobs that we're creating, the financial support that's being delivered in very many different ways through our international finance centre is hugely important. And certainly whilst I remain as Chief Minister, I'm going to continue to promote the island as effectively and efficiently as I can, and also work hard to ensure that we do have and receive, I hope, mutually beneficial and understanding relations with the various senior leaders in the United Kingdom particularly, but also across the Crown Dependencies and Overseas Territory network.
And of course, we've had 14 years of a Conservative government. Have we got any obvious friends or people who know about the Isle of Man in the UK cabinet now? I know David Lammy had at one point had responsibility for the Isle of Man. I'm fairly sure, visited the island, so he at least is aware of the island. Are there any of the others that we have reasonable contacts with?
So, we haven't ignored the Labour Party over the last 3 years since I've been Chief Minister, and of course clearly before that, when Howard Quayle was Chief Minister and doing sort of similar type work. Of course, we tried to meet as many Labour Party members as possible. So, for example, I would certainly highlight Hilary Benn as one individual who will have reasonable knowledge of the Isle of Man. I've been liaising quite heavily with Stephen Doughty, now a junior minister. I met the Cities Minister briefly on Wednesday, and of course now we will expect to meet the Lord Chancellor in the next few months, certainly once the Parliament finishes debating King's Speech and goes on recess, so in September, October, and I will be going to the Labour Party conference. And yes, to a degree there is a cycle now beginning. Many of the senior ministers are sort of somewhat new to us, and we will have to work quite hard to ensure that we get those relationships and we get that understanding and we get that knowledge. And look, not pretending the Isle of Man is right up there at the forefront of their thinking, but it is important that we have at least an acknowledged relationship, and then we'll obviously concentrate where those key points of contact are, which ultimately is the Ministry of Justice and the Lord Chancellor, but as I said, people like the Cities Minister and other individuals in the Treasury are also important contacts for us.
You're listening to Perspective with Chief Minister Alf Cannan. One thing that's certainly been very much alive in the UK media at the moment is the first report into the COVID inquiry. Of course, we've debated in Tynwald this week the Kate Brunner report, and you effectively, as a government, have accepted all the recommendations with a few caveats in terms of whether there's going to be sufficient budget to allow for certain things to happen. What lessons particularly do you think come out of this whole affair?
Ultimately, we should never take emergency planning for granted or somehow assume it's never going to happen to us, because I think, and I speak probably on a fairly personal level here now, but I think this was pretty much reflected in Kate Brunner's assessment. I think we were waiting for the UK to act. Fundamentally, we sat here, watched COVID tunnel down the train lines, if you like, towards us, and until it actually arrived here, we really didn't know what we were actually going to do. So I think if there's anything to be learnt, then we must take ourselves seriously when it comes to preparations for an emergency. And we have to remember that tens of thousands of people families, businesses are actually, will look to the Isle of Man government, and that we can't just rely on the UK government or other people around us to make these decisions. So we must be prepared to act and go by ourselves at an early stage if we feel that the absolute need, or it's in our very best interest. And I hope that if we take nothing else away, that we absolutely take that lesson, and that we treat these exercises and the preparations for this very seriously, and also understand that politicians, senior leaders in the civil service, may be needed to act in such a way that requires emergency powers, requires us to think on the lines of an emergency, and that we must have the ability to quickly instill that effectively and filter through the needs and the actions that the population need to take as quickly as possible. And I think if we had acted earlier, we would have avoided some of the complications that Cape Brunner has come to criticise, such as the return of residents, the way that people were treated in those initial days when we decided that actually emergency powers were needed. This was a serious crisis. And I talked about in my summing up that you have to cast your mind back to remember that we were all gripped to some extent with huge uncertainty. Nobody really knew or understood this virus. People were talking about virus being transmitted by touching pieces of wood or touching pieces of metal. Being transmitted even in the post, I think, was one of the theories that was being bandied about. And actually, I think the scientific community was struggling at the time to really get on top of this. So, of course, when it did decide, actually, we need to act by ourselves, I guess we did act very, very harshly. And, that's why I think there was, for the vast majority of people listening, we protected them, we looked after them. I think lives were definitely saved. But in amongst that, there were people caught up, and as you know from some of the reports that you've been playing on the radio with the Comus residents and things, it wasn't a pleasant experience for some people. And I think had we acted earlier, some of that clearly would have been avoided. So I'm going to take one lesson away. The island's government, in future years now and for the future, must remember there may be a time when it needs to really seriously adopt that very authoritative reaction, and that emergency planning and the understanding of how to deal with emergency and the pressures that will be applied should be rehearsed and understood, so that actually if it happens, we will be able to act, I hope, with much greater pace and understanding of what we need to do.
And of course, one of the difficulties that governments face is that emergency planning for a situation that you do not understand because it's not happened yet is quite a hard thing to keep on your priority list when you are struggling to pay doctors and nurses and dentists the money that they need, when you are struggling to provide for additional educational needs and all the other pressures that government faces. It is quite difficult to keep that emergency planning in a reasonably well-funded position, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've made commitments around the sort of six or so first course 6 recommendations around the necessity to be ready with emergency planners, to have the exercises undertaken that we need to keep people fresh and understanding of what they'll need to do in an emergency. But you're right, at the end of the day, even if it is another pandemic, right, and we have a pandemic plans, what that pandemic actually looks like, what impact it's going to have on people, what the scale of the threat is, may differ. And of course, we know that with the greatest of respect, the best laid plans in the world will not always meet the different aspects that you might encounter, say, if it's a pandemic. And the other issue, of course, is we don't know that it's necessarily going to be a pandemic that is the next emergency threat that the island may face. I mean, the world is very much in a state of flux. We've still got this very serious war going on in Ukraine, and I wouldn't say that we've got stability across the globe by any means. And so whatever that threat is, and we need to be ready for it, but the core comes in terms of the island, I think, accepting that we shouldn't be reliant on other people, that we must prepare ourselves, and we must be willing, be bold to take action, perhaps even before bigger states determine that action is necessary.
One obvious mistake that occurred during all of this was the situation down at Abbotswood. Do you think enough has been done to sort of recognise that, to apologise perhaps for decisions that were taken in relation to that whole situation?
Understanding every single detail about every single thing that happened during COVID just really has not been in my brief, Phil. I think what I would say, care homes were particularly exposed during this period. We could see that even before COVID arrived. Again, in my summing up, I was reminding people that, for literally for weeks, we were staring at television screens with stretchers being taken out of care homes in Spain, in France, in Italy, where it really had such a significant impact on our elderly, vulnerable elderly population. And I think we all, by the time things tightened up over here, we were very conscious of the need that care homes were, and hospitals and care homes were significant points of exposure and threat to people and people's lives. Clearly Abbotswood was deeply unfortunate. Kate Brunner explored that. She went through in her report and made some findings, and I said, in my closing remarks, I was very sorry for the impacts, both, of course, for those families who lost individuals in whatever circumstance during COVID, and let's not, forget that, people did died and people lost loved ones and relatives, and also sorry, where people were caught up, as I said, in whatever circumstance, which had a material impact on their lives. But having said all that, I also want to reflect on those sorts of comments and actually put us into that benchmark where Kate Brunner said that actually broadly we were pretty successful with what we did. We saved a lot of lives. We were, amongst the best performing countries globally in terms of protecting lives, and also, the other side of it, of course, from an economic perspective as well, in terms of the way that was handled. So I think you have to put everything into context. But people lost loved ones, people died, and it's always difficult trying to analyse what went wrong and what happened in every single set of circumstances.
One of the other things that were mentioned was pressure being put on the Director of Public Health to actually change her opinion. As someone who's been in Council of Ministers, I understand that you, as Council of Ministers, of course, you question various things that are said to you, particularly things that are going to make life quite difficult for the Isle of Man, for the way in which government operates. Of course, you are going to question those. But did you experience at all any what you might have felt undue pressure on medical experts to change their opinion?
No, I was conscious of this statement that had been made by the former Director of Public Health, and I think she had inferred that a minister, I don't think it was named, she implied that she'd had some pressure to change an opinion, but of course said that she wasn't going to change the opinion. And I think that statement was made in evidence rather than anything that Kate Brunner had particularly picked up on. What I would say is there was never any, as far as I'm concerned, and I sat through just about all the emergency meetings of the Council of Ministers, and was on the National Strategy Group as well. I sat through all those meetings. There were disagreements about how the evidence being presented, or what the evidence being presented by the medics, how that should be treated, because it has significant impacts across, public services, how people would likely, would feel about such measures being taken. But there was never any disagreement with the health services about what they were presenting. So I don't, I reject that there was any attempt by council and ministers per se to try and change what the medics were saying. They gave their evidence. They told us what the situation was. They told us what they wanted us to do. Did council always take that absolute advice? No, but we were doing that because we had to balance out the needs for the broader population as well, to maintain the economy. Of just shutting it, I think, without getting into too much detail, I think we need to stick to really what Kate Brunner's findings. But there's a balance between shutting everybody down and locking them away effectively, and the need for society still to function. And that the job of the politician at the time was to try and find the right balance between the absolute medical advice, which was shut down, lock up, stay at home completely, to actually somehow things still need to function. Society still needs to breathe, if you like. We need to tick over. We need to get to the shops, and at some point we need to keep our economy ticking over, because otherwise we won't have anything left when you do say it's all right to effectively go back outside. So those balances were always needed to be struck, and there was some pretty heavy conversations at time, and it wasn't easy. But there was never, as far as I was concerned anyway, you must not present that, or you must change things. So,
and of course that is what we effectively elect our members of the House of Keys to do, is to weigh up all the evidence and reach conclusions as to what the best way forward is. And the best way forward is not always an easy way forward.
No, but let's get back to what Kate Brunner actually said, and actually the truth of all this, because we had huge periods of time where we enjoyed our full freedoms, whilst counterparts around us were struggling to retain control of COVID, were in extended periods of lockdowns, and actually it was pretty chaotic scenes in terms of the governance and control that was going on. Over here, if you cast your mind back, and we are going back 4 years now, Phil, it's incredible to think, but we had that long hot summer. We were free. The economy was functioning. People were supporting each other. Yes, we couldn't go anywhere, but in many ways, there was a vibrancy on the island, and a real feeling that we were achieving so much more than everybody around us. Of course, eventually that came to a natural end when COVID came back. But in many ways, what happened for us in that period was a success. And I say that accepting that no one wants a pandemic.
Absolutely.
So we need to put into context what happened alongside, clearly some of the negative issues around how government responded, the harshness of that response in some of the areas, and of course the lives that were lost, and those people who perhaps suffered more than you would have wanted them to from the actions that government decided were necessary.
And that kind of neatly allows us to move on to the next thing, which is your government's attempt to try and rebuild the economy, which effectively was stalled by the whole COVID response. Before I invited you, before you issued this report, I had invited you onto the programme to talk about how effective you had been in delivering Our Island Plan, and lo and behold, a few days later, the Our Island Plan quarterly report was issued, and I'm sure that was a coincidence, but fantastic that you are providing information so that people can see how effective you are being as a government. Why then do you suppose, maybe it's because of a lack of this in the past, but why do you suppose that certainly there seems to be a growing mood in Tynwald that maybe government isn't delivering as much as it should, and there's no doubt that from people I speak to, there's quite a disillusioned mood amongst the public. Is things like this report, this quarterly report, is this an attempt to try and demonstrate that actually government is delivering?
Well, absolutely, we need to demonstrate that we're delivering, and people need to see the facts, because often there's distortion around the facts. So, we are publishing as much as we can the detail and data in terms of what is being delivered. But I said before, Phil, that this has been a very tough 3 years for people. I feel that actually we're coming out into a slightly better space at the moment. We've passed some of, obviously, I think debating the Brunner report may have sort of concluded the COVID years, if you like. And there's a lot to do, but I think we shouldn't be too despondent, because actually when you look at data, when you look at performance, when you look at, and I've already talked about Moody's reports, these independent people from outside saying actually your economy is outperforming other economies across Western Europe. So actually, I think we need to put that into context. The other context, we did set out quite ambitiously to say, actually, if you want to change the island, if you want sustainable growth for the future, then we need to grow. And I need to keep going back to this issue that actually that growth was predicated around jobs and employment and not just people. And we're continuing to see strong evidence that we are succeeding in that front. We've got long queues for immigration in terms of working individuals who need to come here to work, and we're doing our very best to sort that out. We've built 600 additional houses, and there's hundreds more in the pipeline. And of course, we've got our investments in the brownfield sites, which, like everybody else now, I'm just willing to see in terms of getting those spades in the ground and getting those buildings up and running, so we can see actual evidence of what the city of Douglas, particularly in the centre, will look like. But there's other work going on, construction work in terms of housing and apartments around the island. For example, I was in Ramsey the other day, 20 apartments by J.J. Radcliffe Builders in the centre of the old Crystal site, a brownfield site that they've taken, and they're putting on those apartments in the sort of £200,000-250,000 bracket. And I think we're going through this change, but we need to, because otherwise, we can see, otherwise we will have a decline. And we've seen this decline, which we're trying to arrest in terms of high streets and what they look like, and shops and small retail premises and things. But this government has a vision that actually, if we build and we put people back into towns and villages, we take our brownfield sites and we invest in those brownfield sites. And we've had to, because for years they've lain empty. So we've had to take public money and say, actually, developers, listen, there is an incentive here for you to build. You complete this, you will get some reward, and we will help you get through some of those construction costs. But the long-term benefits, I hope, will be is that we will see rejuvenation, and we will keep our high streets, that we will see our towns being regenerated. And there's a long way to go in this transition, and you've got to couple that alongside also the fact we're in this energy transition period as well. And the island has got to get over the line, if you like, in terms of securing its future. And I'm just not in the camp that actually I'll just shove in another interconnector and life's going to be all right, because I do have significant concerns. I almost go back to that COVID type of scenario. Hang on, so we're just going to rely on the UK to supply all our power. What if they get it wrong? That's why getting across the line with Ørsted, which isn't as controversial, obviously, as the onshore programme, but we need to keep ourselves going, and we've got to get ourselves across these hurdles. And of course, they're causing some consternation with people, because change always does cause that consternation. So I think as a society, and also, let's go to this sort of growth plan, if you like. It's not always easy. I mean, I was at the with the inquiry last night and the North and West Area Plan, and hopefully that plan has good broad principles behind it, but it's not always easy. And I was talking to the inspector about balancing the need to retain character in our villages when we're putting in and allocating additional sites for housing. And of course, any housing that's going in is always going to be causing some elements potentially of conflict in the local community. It always does, but but we've still got to get the balance right. But we've still got to grow, and we still need those houses, and we need, for example, homes for our youngsters or younger generation. Also in the villages, some of them want to stay. That's where they've grown up. That's where they want to be. They've got good, community facilities there, local primary schools, a local shop. Quality of life is good. So, getting the balance right and driving this forward in an environment where we've had 2 years of coronavirus, where we've had a year plus of a cost of living crisis, where actually transport links are partly have been disrupted, for example. Add all that together, it's quite a mix, but we're getting through it. We're succeeding in terms of the challenges, in terms of meeting some of those challenges we've set out, and we've still got a long way to go. For us now, and it's why I've set out three key challenges for us to deal with over the summer and to prepare for the autumn around, the position on taxation, because we've got to get our economy going, and I think taxation is going to be key to that. The cost of transport, and we're working with the steam packet to understand.
So actually, if we stick on that taxation point, presumably, if you're talking about getting the economy going, you're talking about reducing taxation in some way.
Well, we need to try. We've had a tax rise brought forward. We put that money directly into health. We've talked about the financial discipline that government needs now, because we can't carry on running a deficit at £126 million, and we've got to get that down. But of course, people also need to breathe in terms of their ability to spend in the local economy and to deal with the additional costs of living, if you like, on an island. And we're taking steps around that to try and make things easier. We've raised child benefit. We've brought parity for first, second, third children in terms of receipts of child benefit. We've invested more, of course, into childcare credits now, so parents can take their very youngest children now pre-primary school and put them into a childcare facility at an earlier stage. So we've done a lot to try and help our young families. But of course we recognise, for an economy now, and align this, say, with the economic growth plans that Keir Starmer's put out for the UK, I think we all want to see us in the best possible position, and we know that actually a lot of pressure has been put on working families. We're all aligned with that. It's now getting the capability to do that, alongside, of course, the pressure that we are seeing, particularly with healthcare spending. But some decisions have got to be made, and that's why, of course, government efficiency and how government is controlling that, and that means staffing numbers, for example, which is clearly high priority for people, and that's why I've talked about getting control of that, first of all, in terms of proper data, so that people understand what the size of government is, but also understanding, do we have areas where actually we could bring more effective efficiencies to. So all that sort of work is going on now over the summer, and I do sort of see us now coming into a new phase, if you like. We cleared some of this coronavirus sort of, we've still got hangovers, but that's, we should park that now. Move ourselves on.
Effectively, you can't use that as an excuse anymore.
No, I think there's impacts still, but again, we put one of the highlights in this quarterly plan is this 4,000 or so operations that we've undertaken in this phase 2 of this restoration and recovery programme, and the £18 million that we've spent doing that, in terms of delivering that for people who've been waiting for operations, and been in pain for some considerable time, hips, knees, ophthalmology, all that sort of focus has taken place, and we've delivered those 4,000 operations. There's still a waiting list there. We're going to have to decide whether or not we've got the funds available to kind of tackle it in the way that we've had, or whether that's just going to have to go into business as usual. But again, right, I think comparatively benchmarked against what's been going on elsewhere, and we've pushed ourselves ahead of the game. And I'm not, doesn't mean to say we still haven't got lots of challenges, but that quarterly plan will tell you we have made some very strong progress in tackling this. We haven't been sitting there twiddling our thumbs. We've actually taken bold decisions and said, okay, we'll support Treasury Minister, the Health Minister, and take that. And Tim Ward supported it and said, take that extra £18 million, invest it, and let's get these operations done so that we haven't got such a backlog and so people aren't hanging around for such a long time in pain, and they need these operations. So they've been done and delivered. So,
Mr. Speaker isn't generally a thorn in the side of government. He is perhaps reasonably well known for being quite balanced in terms of his assessment of political affairs. He is the one that's trotting out this line about the millions of pounds for a developer to develop luxury flats. Can you understand that perhaps, well, the public will look at this and the public elect you to get on and do stuff. They don't want to know all the detail, so they won't understand all the motivation and the thinking behind this. But they look at this and think, where's government's priority here? Surely to goodness we should be investing that in infrastructure, public infrastructure that needs to be sorted out, not encouraging developers to develop luxury flats.
So the Island Infrastructure Scheme was brought about. So I need to put this into the context of a scheme, of a publicly, council-supported initiative. And let's be brutal, Phil. For years, brownfield sites have been a proverbial pain in the backside for successive governments. And in fact, as far back as I can remember, I'm a relative baby with 13 years experience, but we've tried and failed to get these sites across the line at great frustration. And ultimately, the government has said, look, we will help you with your base costs of constructing, digging into, repairing, if you like, the brownfield sites, getting them ready for you to be able to build. You come along with your ideas. If those ideas fit the criteria that we have outlined, in other words, the viability of that building would not otherwise be viable unless you had some support. We will then support you, and provided you complete and build what you said you're going to build, then we will give you the appropriate agreed amount of support or payback for doing that. And we've seen that now outlined in terms of the apartments that are being built in Lake Road. We're negotiating on Lord Street. We've done the Villiers site, and of course there is a site down in Port Erin as well. Now, the question is, should we have invested that money in brownfield sites? I would say yes. Do these developments bring local economic benefits? Yes, they create jobs. And in fact, I would argue that most of them will pay themselves back anyway, just simply through the jobs and economic value that they will create, even during that construction phase. If they don't pay it back in full, it will certainly go a long way. But also, I think once you initiate these developments, we can also see evidence that other developments will also then, other constructors will take heart and get confidence in that local area, and other benefits will flow. And the other point is, we go back to this issue now, okay, Port Erin may not be the best case in the world, because as far as I can see it, not a local MHK there, but it's a beautiful place, right? Particularly in the summer, it attracts a lot of people down. I sense that some of those businesses will have a better opportunity, and from a local domestic economy perspective, than perhaps others, because of the sort of visitor base that it attracts. Just even from the island during those summer periods. But nevertheless, these types of buildings and these types of constructions will help cement that local economy, will ultimately be of benefit. And yes, the government's got to get on and it's got to build in other areas, but you have to understand the principles that we were applying as people back in towns, back in villages, eases the pressure on greenfield sites and should bring greater benefits to that very specific local area economy as well. Now, we've seen apartments down in Port Erin. We've got apartments in Lake Road. They're a much, much greater value in terms of their affordability. We've got plans coming up for Lord Street, and of course, they've been pictured in the newspapers, and of course we've seen the Villiers as well, and that may well be hotel type accommodation. But the point is the vibrancy that we talk about, the brownfield site, confidence that people will get that government is supporting this, and that the benefits it will bring to that local area are undisputable. But of course, we've got to make sure that we're also focusing, on all areas of our economy, and particularly that when that comes to housing as well. And that's why we've done the housing need assessment, and we've got a better understanding of where government needs to be for low-cost, affordable housing moving forward, and we will respond to that in October.
I suppose the final and very brief answer, if you could, when the next tranche of funding from the fund for you to kickstart development comes along, you would welcome developments such as the Lord Street site, which would have things like facilities, public facilities, as well, like a bus station, for example, or if someone had a plan for a care home, it would certainly play better in the public mind than luxury flats.
Well, I think, but if you're just taking one example of a scheme that was met the criteria and was given the go ahead, actually, if you take the balance of what's being looked at, there's a variety of sites and uses being constructed out of this. We've obviously got the Manx Development Corporation plans that are going on for the nurses' home as well, the affordable housing that they're building up in Westmoreland Road. So actually there is a lot going on, and I talked about the other private development that I know has been privately funded, but the site in Ramsey with the 20 apartments going up there. So listen, there's a lot of work to do, but we've had to kickstart this. I think we've done the right thing, and actually these will have long-term benefits for people, for the island, particularly for the local area, and you can see actually the confidence, I think, even in the south. I know there's a fantastic new sort of restaurant and bar facility being created in Port St Mary. You know that on that top of that Happy Valley area there, they've got some fantastic apartments going. And yeah, they're not low cost apartments by any stretch. But we've got also to be a broad brush community. And I think one of the beauties about the island is that we've had a large degree of harmony on the island. And that's because we've always been very much working together as a community and coming together in so many different ways. And we've got to build the right mix of property so that actually as an island we can function together properly. And we spent a lot of focus in terms of just delivering on our housing need. We've had more first-time buyers, by the way, in the last year than we've had for a decade or so plus through the government register. So actually we are making progress. There's still a long way to go. There's an absolute need to concentrate and focus on housing, and we'll be debating this again, as I said, when we bring forward the housing needs assessment. But there's also strong evidence that we are making considerable progress as well, Phil.
That was Heir and Michael MHK and Chief Minister Alf Cannan. Are you convinced by the Chief Minister's upbeat assessment? Are things beginning to change now? And are we on the cusp of seeing the Canada administration deliver on its promises? Jam tomorrow, or are we beginning to see some jam today? For now, I'm Phil Gorn, Gunnar Myers and Geisha Crum. Thanks for listening.